The Justin Trudeau government in Canada, which is already collapsing because Mr. Trudeau has resigned. The Liberal Party has to find a new leader. Remember, over the last 2 years, ever since he stood up in the Canadian Parliament in September of 2023 and made those wild allegations about Indian agents being involved in the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, from assassination on Canadian soil to involvement of top Indian officials, Trudeau tried to paint this whole web of lies around the Nijjar killing, all of which have come crumbling today. The Canadian top court in British Columbia, the Supreme Court of British Columbia, has let off all the 4 accused in this case, citing, quote, a lack of evidence, which simply means that the prosecution, the police, did not have, or at least have not shown yet, the proof of the involvement of these 4 individuals in the plot to kill Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Now, as Trudeau packs his bags, because remember, a few days ago, he announced to the Canadian people and to the rest of the world that he's putting in the towel. He is, resigning as leader of the Liberal Party, as Prime Minister of Canada. He's now left with this whole question mark as to where all this pandering to the Khalistani elements has actually left him and his Liberal Party. And the bigger question, will his successor now be able to use this as a clean slate for a fresh start with this diplomatic mess that we've seen that Trudeau leaves behind, particularly in the relationship between New Delhi and Ottawa?
India was involved in this killing agents. This was something that we obviously had to take extremely seriously.
All right, I want to go across to Terry Miliuski, author and journalist, who's joining us live from Toronto, and Sushant Sareen is Senior Fellow with the Observer Research Foundation. He'll be joining us in a moment. Mr. Miliuski, thank you very much for joining us. This is what the Supreme Court in British Columbia, which gave bail to these 4 accused in the Nijjar murder, had to say today. It highlighted concerns regarding the prosecution's inability to provide sufficient evidence. Specifically, the court said there was no substantive progress in the judicial proceedings since the arrest of these 4 individuals. They were first produced in court in early May. So for the last 6 months plus, they've been incarcerated, they've been apprehended. And the court has raised questions about whether the adequate evidence existed at all in the first place to support the charges that have been brought forth against these individuals. How concerned would you be? How worried would you be after these observations by the Supreme Court of British Columbia?
Well, it's hard to tell because, as is typical in Canadian courts, the whole case is wrapped in this cocoon of secrecy, publication bans. We're not allowed to report on the arguments made on pre-trial motions. It's very difficult. We have to read into what we are seeing to deduce what's happening. I have a theory, which I'll offer as an informed guess, if you like. That is that the case faces real problems, not with a lack of evidence, but with producing the evidence in court, making that evidence admissible and available, because it involves in large measure evidence that wasn't gathered in Canada, but was gathered in both India and in the United States by the Americans. Now, is the incoming Trump administration willing to cooperate with the Canadian court, produce witnesses and documents and evidence in their activities? As you know, they've laid 2 serious indictments against Indian nationals, one of which was, at least, an intelligence officer for the research and analysis wing of the Indian government, which reports to the Indian Prime Minister, as you know. These are very serious allegations involving an alleged murder plot by this individual and
Mr. Miliuski, if I may interrupt, I'm sorry to do that, though. can you explain what is the difficulty in producing the evidence? Because the Trump administration is not in office right now. Nijjar murder happened when Biden was in office. The material, if it is available, should already be there. So I'm not sure I follow why the incoming Trump administration would be a problem in the production of this evidence of a crime that happened 2 years ago.
Well, that's a perfectly fair question. I've asked it myself. You're absolutely right. It's a problem, and it's not easy to explain when you're guessing. I'm just offering you an educated evidence.
Okay.
Motive. And the prosecution in any case of murder is going to have to show motive. Well, if they were able to produce the American evidence in a Canadian court, big if, then they might be able to show motive because he has laid out the evidence of a plot to kill two people that are named, one being Gopal Singh Nijjar, who seeks the justice, and the other being Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Now, the Indian government has already said it's taking these allegations very seriously. The individual involved has been fired. So these are serious allegations. But are they going to be available in a Canadian court? If I were a defense lawyer, I would be salivating at the billable hours. I'm making a pile of money looking at all of the arguments. Well, how is the Canadian court supposed to accept this? Can we get a witness from the FBI or the Department of Justice to come and testify to the authenticity of all of these details? Because if we don't have that evidence,
okay, that's an interesting theory, and I want to know what Sushant thinks about it. Mr. Milewski's contention, this is a hypothesis, is that it's not the lack of evidence, but the ability to produce that evidence, and whether now under a new Trump administration, and we've seen the back and forth between Mr. Trump and Mr. Trudeau over the last few weeks or so, whether the FBI under Trump will allow for the production of that evidence in a court of law, and whether FBI officials will sort of testify in a Canadian court of law to back up that evidence, because clearly the political dynamics between Canada and the United States have changed.
Yes.
But Zaka, here's the problem. For the last 2 years, as the question you yourself raised with Mr. Milewski, for the last 2 years, the Canadians were able to build whatever case they built because apparently the Americans shared some intelligence with them. Mm-hmm. Now, intelligence is number one, not evidence, right? So if it was only intelligence that was shared and it's not prosecutable evidence, then it has no meaning, first and foremost. Secondly, the thing is that given the fact that the Biden administration was willing to do this, why haven't they shared all the evidence so far? Why did they have to wait until after the the next administration comes in or the US elections take place? They could have already shared the evidence. They haven't. Maybe the Americans also don't have it. Like Mr. Milewski is guessing, even I'm guessing. Third, and most importantly, look, once you have a very sensitive case like this, okay, and a very serious case insofar as Canada is concerned, because we have plenty of grouses against Canada and the way they have dealt with these Khalistani thugs. But once there is a case like this, the proper thing they should have done is that they should have kept it quiet. They should have first gathered the evidence, which is what they normally do. You don't level these allegations, these wild allegations, without having any evidence. And for the last 2 years, what was the Indians asking the Canadians? We were constantly asking them that, okay, if you have the evidence, why don't you share it with us? The Americans did it. And as a result, that particular investigation moved forward. The Canadians never did it. They haven't shared anything with us. They keep saying and they keep telling their media, which swallows and vomits.
I think we just lost Sushant. I think I would have partially bought that hypothesis, Mr. Milewski. The only problem is, it's been over 6 months since these 4 chaps were apprehended. They were apprehended first in May, and there have been 5 court appearances by these 4 individuals. They were produced in court 5 times over the last 6 months. On the 7th of May, on the 15th of May, on the 21st of May, on the 1st of October. And this I find fascinating. If the evidence was indeed there, why did the Crown prosecutor, who's the lawyer representing the state, Louis Kenworthy, ask for an adjournment? Because according to him, there were ongoing disclosure issues indicating that substantive disclosure has not been made or completed. Basically saying that we don't have the evidence right now or the documentation right now disclosure basically means that the prosecution has to make available whatever material they have to the defense lawyers. He asked for an adjournment in October saying, we've not been able to collect the material so that we can share the material, disclose that material to the defense lawyers. And then the last hearing that happened in November, where the case was subsequently then moved to the Supreme Court of British Columbia, the Crown asked for a stay of proceedings in the provincial court. It indicated a shift in why the prosecution intended to intended to move the case from a provincial court to a Supreme Court. Now, the point is simply this. If the evidence was there, A, why was it not disclosed? If the evidence was there, why was the prosecution asking for adjournments? I think Sushant is right. The evidence was never there.
We don't know for sure exactly what evidence is available and what is not because of the complexities that are involved here. First of all, what about classification? The evidence that was produced between governments, not for public consumption, between the State administration and the Trudeau administration at the time, was classified evidence. That is to say, we're not allowed to talk about it in public. But we can tell you that we've got wiretaps that confirms Canadian suspicions of the Canadian police. There was some sort of a link with an Indian official between that official and the shooters in the Nijjar case. But to go to trial with that, well, you've got to overcome that classification. If the U.S. government is not going to agree to disclosure in court, then that's got to, and if it is to agree to it, it's still all got to be up for grabs for the defense to probe.
No, but Mr.
Well,
Miliuski, the same applied in the case that happened in the U.S. Allegedly, the man who was hired as a hitman for this alleged assassination plot on Pannu happened to be a state agent in the U.S. So if they could open that evidence in a court of law, in a Manhattan court, the same should apply in Canada.
No. The problem is that this very different law in Canada and the U.S. In Canada, don't get me started, but the rules are very different on producing it. You're not allowed to produce it before the trial. You're not allowed to make it public and basically blacken somebody's name before they have a chance to answer it in court. And it's much more cautious.
Okay.
Lawyers in Canada get rich arguing this stuff forever and ever about admissibility and availability.
Okay.
That alone accounts for enormous amount of delay.
I'll give Sushant the final word because, Sushant, just to play devil's advocate, these guys are out on bail. No one's given them a clean sheet. They've not been acquitted by a court of law. And this evidence that Mr. Terry talks about can still be produced during trial. They are yet to start the trial.
So here's the problem. If the evidence, whenever the evidence is produced, we'll see what evidence they have against these guys. But the point is that if Canadian law does not allow for the sullying of somebody's image or destroying somebody's life by plastering their faces all over the place and accusing them of a crime for which you have no evidence, you haven't even filed a charge sheet so far. In that case, what happens to these four guys? Right? What have you done with their lives, first and foremost? Secondly, if you didn't have the evidence...
That's why they got bailed. That's why they got bailed.
Was Nijjar such an important guy for you that you shot your entire relationship with India? You have brought it, it's at even a worse level than what it was in the 80s. You brought it to that level simply for what? Without any evidence, simply for your own political reasons, and even that has not worked because Trudeau has finally, had to quit. And his party is in all kinds of trouble, probably going to be wiped out in the next election. And maybe that is a good thing for Canada, really. But you shot this entire relationship for what? Without any evidence. This is like I going or I as the Prime Minister of India talking about Trudeau and his involvement with criminal gangs and making all kinds of scurrilous allegations without a shred of evidence.
I think that's a fantastic point that Sushant made.
That's how countries behave.
Even if they have the evidence, we'll wait to see what the evidence is, if at all it is produced in trial. If the purpose of Mr. Trudeau in going public with these allegations was politics, let's be very clear about it. He was trying to make a political point, or he thought that politically this would help him. look where he's ended up. So that's the whole, it became a zero-sum game. It cost him his job. I don't think this cost him his job, but ultimately, he's no longer going to be the Prime Minister of Canada. He's probably, going to be in political oblivion now, or political retirement, as it were. We'll leave it at that. Thank you very much to Mr. Milewski. Thank you very much, Sushant.